Welcome to our third event of our series on the European elections and the preparation of the European elections. I'm very pleased to welcome here a fantastic panel, four different point of views, four different experiences, four different expertise. And I think it's a privilege for all of us to be here today, to have the opportunity to hear and to interact with our panelists. The topic, as you know, is a general topic, is a very important one, is about migrations, borders. It will be one of the main topics of the European electoral campaign, and it will be probably the most important topic of the post-elections European discussion. It was not the case five years ago. 5 years ago, the migration issue was not the number one, both in the electoral campaign and in the post-elections discussions. Even the Spitzenkandidaten debate among the different Schulz, Juncker, Verhofstadt, the different candidates to the position of the president of the Commission, the migration issue wasn't the number one, but even the number 10th, I have to say. It was really a very marginal issue. Then, in the last 5 years, all the European debate was really influenced, focused, and many of the European decisions or internal turmoils, decisions, or like the referendum and the internal discussion in the UK on the Brexit referendum, the big changes in some countries' political landscape. I mean Germany, Austria, Italy, of course. It is the topic that created, again, for the first time after the big enlargement, a new cleavage, a new East-West cleavage within the European Union. So it was really turmoil in the last 5 years. Now we are at the electoral moment. So it was when with Florence Hegel, we discussed the topics of our series of seminars on the elections. We immediately focused migrations, borders as one of them. And I'm very pleased today to have this panel. I repeat, it's really a fantastic panel. I will immediately introduce our panelists because we have time to listen them, to interact with them, but what is really very important for us is to have and to give them the right time for having their presentations. The first presentation would be Craig Spencer. Craig is from the US. He is from Columbia University. He's at PSIA in this very period. He's teaching. But he's here, first of all, because he's an expert on health, but first of all, because of his experience within the Mediterranean on the Aquarius boat. So it's his experience on safe and rescue is really unique. And this is why we asked him to be a panelist here and to give his contribution exactly on safe and rescue. You will see that this seminar will try to have a different approach on the different topics in which usually we mix everything is just one box, and it's the big mistake for all the migrants issue discussion at the European level, in the political debate, but not only in the political debate. And we mix together safe and rescue, refugees, migrant policies, integration. In reality, it is, and we have to face very different issues. This is why we tried here to have 4 voices with 4 different issues And these 4 different issues are really very focused. And one of these issues is search and rescue. And Craig will be our first speaker. After Craig, Loïc Azoulai. Loïc Azoulai is law professor at Sciences Po, and Loïc will give us a contribution on migrants' arrival and the present European law. That is, of course, another point of view that is very important. The third presentation will be by Virginie Guiraudon. It will be mostly on borders, so the internal and external border policy in this very period, of course, from his political science perspective. And last but not least, we are pleased to have Francesca Borgonovi from the OECD. She's senior analyst at the OECD on education policies, on integration in the education field. So inclusive education approaches is the topic that we asked Francesca Borgonovi to present here. So I stop immediately here. Craig, you have 10 minutes. We know you have very interesting pictures and slides, so you have the floor.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for having me. I'm first going to start by talking a little bit on my time on the Aquarius. The Aquarius, if you don't know, was a search and rescue vessel that was chartered by Médecins Sans Frontières and SOS Méditerranée. I was on board in 2017 and 2018, working as a doctor at that time. And I remember one morning when we got a call. We were basically on call at any point. We could get a call at 11 p.m. or 5 in the morning. And this day was quite early. We got a call about a boat in distress. We were asked to turn our engines on and get there as fast as we could. We were given the coordinates, and we made it to where we found a boat with 140 people on board. Within the span of a couple hours, we had rescued everyone, and I remembered particularly one young boy as he was coming on board and just looking at him and seeing how sick and malnourished and broken he was. And I knew that he was going to spend a lot of time in our clinic over the next couple days. This 16-year-old boy, I'll call him Musa, was from Gambia, and he had left his home 9 months earlier to make this journey. And I think his story highlights so well exactly what we're supposed to be talking about here today, which is migration, values, and borders. And more specifically, his story, I think, represents the fact that migration is difficult, it's dangerous, and most importantly, it's inevitable. In terms of values, I think his story highlights the fact that there is currently a juxtaposition between long-held European EU values around migration and actual policy that is being implemented regarding migration in many countries in the EU. And I think lastly, when we talk about the borders, we need to recognize that although by many quantitative statistics, the current approach to managing migration through the construction of basically the southern border of the European Union in the detention centers of Libya and in the deserts of the Sahel, well, it may be working, but the question for all of us is really at what cost? And so I want to start by talking about migration. And I want to show you this picture. This is the story of Musa. We drew this together over an afternoon, over about 2 to 3 hours. And he told me every single place that he had been since he had left his home in the Gambia. He could tell me how many days he spent in Bamako, how many nights he slept at the bus station. He could tell me how much a chicken cost in Sabha, and he could tell me how much it cost to get on one of the boats that would hopefully bring him to the Italian shores. He told me this in such amazing clarity, and he said it with really just such a straight face. And I was sitting there and I was looking at him, again, this kid, he left home when he was 15, he was now 16. He left home at 80 kilos, he was 40 kilos. He was very, very sick. And I'd asked him, knowing what you know now, knowing what happened to you in Sabha, knowing what happened to you in detention centers, knowing what happened when you went out to the sea for the first time and you saw your boat driver get shot because he lost his way, knowing what happened the second time when you went out to sea and someone came out and tried to sink your boat with a piece of wood with a nail through it, and knowing now that you're on this boat, would you have done this again? Would you have went back and told 9-month younger Musa that this is a stupid idea? And he looked at me and he was almost shocked by the stupidity of my question. And he said, I had no other choice. Knowing what I know now, of course I would go, because the other option was to stay at home and die. And so when I think of his story, I think of the 66 million other people that this graphic is hopefully meant to represent, the 66 million other people that are on the move today that have been forced from their home. And many of them have stories just as horrible and just as devastating as the 16-year-old boy that I met on the boat. And I know that we're in the EU, and I know that I'm a US citizen talking about EU migration, and it's very clear that we have our own issues. I'm happy to talk about those. But here in the EU, at least there continues to, I don't know, to be this understanding that human rights actually matter. And so I think about that when I think about this map, because when we talk about migration, we assume that we're talking about illegal migration or about people that shouldn't be here, and we're talking about this. When you think about this, this is just an extremely small proportion of where migrants are and where migrants are coming. If you think about the number of people that have arrived since 2016 in the European Union, it's just over 700,000, which might sound like a lot. That's actually less than 1/3 of the number of Syrians living in Lebanon. And Lebanon is a state smaller than Montenegro. So when we think about scale and we think about the size of the migration crisis, it's important to keep that in mind when we're talking about this, especially with respect to the EU. So that's one of the issues in terms of migration. It's difficult, it's dangerous, and it's not going to stop. There are going to be people like Musa that are going to be leaving regardless of how big we build Fortress Europe. For me, from a values perspective, I learned on the Aquarius that there's this glaring juxtaposition between the long-held values of the EU and its response to migration, particularly in the Mediterranean. And I say that because when I got on the Aquarius in 2017, there were 9 other NGOs. These were all doing search and rescue. This was in addition to the Italian Coast Guard, which had 2 boats. So in addition to Operation Sophia, Frontex, other vessels, commercial vessels, that were out there performing search and rescue. Today, there is 1, and it took them just over 3 weeks to get a couple dozen people off board that they had rescued a couple weeks ago. In the time that I was first on the boat until now, there has been a targeted criminalization of NGOs in the Mediterranean. It has been done such to increase the number of boats from 10 to 0. The Aquarius and others have had to shut down. Ship captains have been thrown into prison or have been persecuted. Ships themselves have been impounded, and there has been cases brought against many boats which have been, we know, have been false or claimless, but have been meant really just to undermine the legitimacy of NGOs working in the Mediterranean. That's bad, but I think at the exact same time, what makes it even worse is the juxtaposition of the assistance that's given to the Libyan Coast Guard. And I know when I say Libyan Coast Guard, people laugh, because currently Libya is a state that doesn't really exist in many ways. There's a GNA in Tripoli, and Haftar is advancing. It's a place of utter discord and civil war in many respects. And one of the few things that does seem to function is the Libyan Coast Guard, because it's received millions and millions of dollars from the European Union to supplant NGOs' roles in terms of rescuing people in the sea and bringing them back to detention centers where we know they're raped, beaten, tortured, and abused. And I know a lot of these stories just from hearing them, and I know what the Libyan Coast Guard does because everyone that does search and rescue knows it. But it was on this day in May 2017, when we were in the middle of a normal operation, normal search and rescue. Things had gone pretty well. And the Libyan Coast Guard had shown up with big guns and had started shooting in the air. All the little dots you see are people in their life preservers who jumped into the water because they were afraid of what would happen if they got caught by the Libyan Coast Guard. They know what would happen. They would go back to Libya. And the last time I was on the Aquarius, we were trying to do a rescue of a ship, and the ship had a motor, and they were trying so hard to get away from us. And we finally caught up with them. We said, what was going on? They said, oh, we thought you guys were the Libyans. We decided we were going to crash our boat and all die. They took a vote inside this boat that we're all going to crash this boat and die instead of being rescued by the Libyans and going back to Libya. So for me, there's this juxtaposition between how we criminalize and currently criminalize NGO search and rescue and how we're supporting, a militia, really an armed militia that's getting a lot of money from the European Union to take people and bring them back to detention centers that we're all complicit in continuing to support. Many of you may not know this, but the EU has decided to close down Operation Sophia, which basically means there is no concerted effort by the European Union right now to make sure that people who leave Libyan shores have any chance of being rescued. And although the numbers of people leaving has declined, the risk of death for someone that gets on a boat in Libya in an attempt to cross the Mediterranean has gone up twofold just in the past year. So your risk is 1 in 14, which means if there are 100 or something people in here, 8 or 9 of you would likely die if you tried to cross the Mediterranean. All right, so that's a question of values. I think the ultimate question is borders. When I was on the boat, everyone told me, and Musa told me, yeah, the boat's tough, Libya's tough, but you know what's really, really, really tough? Getting across the desert. They put 25 people in the back of a truck and they go really, really fast, and if you fall out, they can't stop for you because it's the sand. And this was before the criminalization of migration that took place in Niger. This is a picture of Agadez. This is also a picture of what some call the southern border of Europe. This is a kind of toll and way station just north of Agadez, which is a city in the middle of the desert in Niger. Niger is now the largest recipient per capita of EU funding, any country in the world, and the majority of it is linked to migration. The goal is to prevent, you see how all of these paths go through Agadez. Agadez is conveniently a city in the desert, and a lot of the counter-migration measures have been meant to stem the tide of people passing through Agadez. To the point that there's been so much discord within the country, and especially within Agadez, many people, including the mayor, think that it's become a laboratory for migration policies. And I'm working on a project there. I was just in Agadez a couple months ago talking to people, and we can talk a little bit more about the impact of EU funded mechanisms that are meant to transition people from migration to other activities, and why they're not working so well. So just to wrap up, I think we can talk about migration, values, and borders in a couple different ways, and we can think about them in a couple different ways. We can think about them like this, as this really big, vast, grand metaphor that's hard to tackle and really difficult to see the clarity. Or we can think about them like this, which is the reality of what's happening. Thankfully, this boat was out there when we were out there and we were able to rescue them. There are now likely every day or every week, or definitely every month, boats that are just like this that are leaving Libyan shores with people on board who are ultimately drowning or being brought back to Libya because there's no search and rescue mechanism out there. But if you look at it like this, I encourage you to not look at it too quickly, because there are things that you're likely going to overlook, like the fact that this is the exact same boat out in the distance that is basically just sitting helpless out in the middle of the Mediterranean. And oftentimes on board, there are unique needs and requirements. And I think that this picture for me highlights, probably more than others, the exact needs that are present for migrants that are on this route. And the reason that we, be it search and rescues, be it NGOs, be it the European Union, via Frontex or Operation Sophia, but there needs to be people out there, because there are situations and needs like this that are happening that are just currently being blinded and we're not paying attention to. And that's it for me.
Thank you, Craig. Loïc.
Thank you. Okay, so I will be more abstract. I don't have this experience on the ground, but what I should like to do is to briefly reflect on the way European law frames the issue of migrants' arrivals. How European law structures the action of member states and institutions at the borders, at the external borders of the EU, and by doing so, how European law structures or destructures the lives of migrants. Because focusing on law allows to do exactly this, to constantly shift from the institutional to the existential, from the action of the institutions to the social reality and the lives of the migrant. Focusing on law also means that I will present a distorted view of the reality. For law reflects a certain reality. It is partly an imagined reality. Facts and lives are mixed up with representations and values. So now, to keep it short, I've squeezed, it's a very vast topic, but to keep it short, I've squeezed my points into a limited number of propositions. I have 4 propositions. And each of them, of course, are disputable and to be discussed. These are opening points. So my first proposition, is that European migration law mainly reflects the values, worldviews, as well as the feelings and fears of Europeans. And it much less reflects the values, worldviews, frustration, and hardships of migrants. And when I say values here, I do not mean ideals, noble values like freedom, human rights, and dignity, abstract value. I mean values as cultural representations embedded in a particular socio-historical context. There is no doubt that in today's Europe, immigrations and borders is a field where Europeans have strong feelings, where they collectively carry representations. Now, these feelings largely express fears, insecurity, distress. They may also express guilt. And EU law reflects all of this. In EU law today, the migrant is mostly seen as a threat, not worthy of trust, but sometimes is seen as a victim, which is related to guilt of Europeans. Now, interestingly here, the threat is very much related to the notion of arrival itself. In Europe today, as reflected again in European law, by contrast maybe with the past, perhaps by contrast partly with the US today, the panic is not so much or not only about settlement of foreigners into national communities, integration of foreigners into national community. The panic is very much about the arrivals of migrants. It's very striking to me. It's about people having Europe as their unique destination. And so, therefore, the primary aim of European law, of the EU and its law, is to prevent people from reaching Europe in the first place. Arrival is the notion. Now, make no mistake that EU law strains to accommodate Europe people's views and feelings does not mean that values in the classic sense of noble ideals, freedom, dignity, human rights, it doesn't mean that values and rights are absent. They operate, but they operate as limits in certain cases. For example, when Poland refuses relocation of migrants on the grounds of the ethnic origin and religious beliefs of the migrants. Or for example, when Denmark suggests to push back migrants in a small inhabited isolated island in the north of the country. There you have institutional values that play a crucial role as limits, as constraints on member states, as constitutional requirement to which all the actors are subject. But they are not the driver. The driver, again, I believe, by looking into European law, the driver is a complex combination of concerns, emotions, and representations the policymakers believe to be the dominant people's view. That's my first proposition. Second proposition. This is slightly more complicated than this in practice. For actually, the EU has set up two distinct systems governing access to its territory, governing arrival. There are two different systems. The first one consists of institutions and laws that enable the entry of certain categories of people to member states' territories. These are what the Commission calls the legitimate travelers. The legitimate travelers. The millions of tourists, visitors, business people, seasonal workers coming to Europe each year. A new regulation has just been agreed on EU visa last February, and this regulation aims at, I quote, facilitating access of these people. So we have a system that can be referred to as a system of mobility, the system of mobility set up by the EU, facilitating entry to the territory of the member states. Now there is another system that consists of institutions, equipments, laws, that is meant to deny access to unwanted migrants. It is a system of non-entry, of non-entrée, if you want. And this system is based on four pillars: Schengen, the European Asylum System, Dublin, return policy, the policy on return, and Frontex. And this is what we are used to designate as the EU migration system by oppositions to the EU mobility system. Now, the aim of this migration system is twofold. One is to tighten the external borders, and the other one is to prevent secondary movements of irregular migrants throughout the Union. Now, something interesting is that the mobility system tends to be permeated by elements of the other system, the migration system. And this is clearly reflected in the last regulation adopted in February, where you can read that the new visa rules should also help counter security risks and the risk of irregular migration to the EU. So it's about facilitating the entry, but at the same time to counter the risk of irregular migrations and security risk. And to do this without jeopardizing the aim of facilitations of travels, this involves a range of techniques, different techniques, specific techniques. For example, third countries and private actors like carriers are encouraged or forced to deny access prior to departure. For example, member states granting visa should assess the risk of irregular migration or the risk of overstaying irregularly in the UN before granting the visa. For example, member states have no obligations, have full discretion to grant humanitarian visas, or third countries are encouraged to readmit the nationals that are in irregular situations in the EU. So we have two different systems. Now, third proposition. In relation to irregular arrivals that the Union is confronted to, it is there that the Union is confronted to this equation. Now, it's the special way the Union has to solve the equation is to remove one of the three terms. One term cannot be removed. This is a fact of migration. Migratory routes may change, they may move, but the flow does not stop, and it is not likely to stop. Therefore, the Union plays out with the two other terms, values and borders. One way to solve the equation is to remove the borders by moving the border controls outside the Union territory. And this is a heavy trend that we have in the Union, that is called externalization, and which has been playing a crucial role over the last years. As you know, as Craig said, the EU outsources border controls by creating a zone around its external border, a zone that is increasingly distant from the EU territory, where third countries, non-state actors, are assisted by the EU in order to create a whole infrastructure with a view to preventing departure of migrants to Europe. As he said, Niger and Chad now are seen as the southern border of Europe. The other way to proceed is to remove the values, or, to be more accurate, to shift the responsibility of protecting values on outsiders, on external actors. And this is exactly what we observe today in the waters of Mediterranean. Today, this is a heavy legal trend. These waters are an area of intensive securization and militarization. The Sophia operation is a military operation. It's based on the provision of the EU Treaty concerning security and defense policy. The objective is to disrupt models of human smuggling and trafficking networks. However, if you look into the decision concerning setting up the Sophia operations, if you look into the decision, it is also laid down that the operations include the obligation to assist persons in distress. Here is the value. So we have enshrined in law a dichotomy between policing tasks, military tasks, and a fundamental value or a humanitarian ideal, that is the duty of assistance. How does it translate in practice? How do these coexist in practice? What I see is that it works through a shifting of responsibility. Member states who are held responsible to render assistance according to EU law, according to international law, are very reluctant today to do so. So they tend to outsource humanitarian concerns to NGOs, which work in coordination and under the supervision of member state authorities. However, this increasingly goes with a form of distrust and suspicions toward these NGOs. So you have outsourcing, and then you have suspicion. Increasingly, yes, I have to make it shorter. Increasingly, assistance is equated with smuggling. Craig explained very clearly. So we have a very odd equation at the end. We have an equation where values are there in the law, but they are evaded by the member states, entrusted to an NGO which are then accused of corrupting these values. Last propositions. I have 1 minute. For the last proposition, the fourth proposition. One might be tempted to argue that this equation, reconciling borders, migrations, and value, is possible at least in one field, the field of asylum. And indeed, European people are usually more favorably disposed towards refugees, and you have this in European law. This is reflected. The protection of refugees is inscribed as a value in the EU treaties. You have a right to claim for the status of refugee. You have a right to remain in the EU territory, even though you cross the border irregularly, if you are an asylum seeker. Now, so there is a clear, it seems there is a clear dichotomy between values on the side of the refugees and strong negative feelings on the side of migrants. Yet again, this dichotomy is not clear as it seems. For in EU law has been introduced recently a strong element of suspicion that many of those presenting themselves as potential refugees do not have a legitimate claim to asylum. And as a result of this, different techniques again have been introduced. And one technique, one concept that is central here is the concept of abuse. The idea that asylum seekers are victims as much as potential abusers. It's very strongly here. And so, in a way, EU law conveys a message that EU values may be subject to corruptions, but here, by the migrants themselves. So I conclude in one sentence. I would say that in relation to arrivals, the EU and its law speaks the language of values, but what it means by value is not the liberal ideas of freedoms, dignity, and human rights. It's more about what policymakers believe to be people's perceptions and sensibilities, which may be right. We have to discuss that. Second, liberal values are not completely absent, however. They have a role to play, but the responsibility to uphold these values is outsourced, and this outsourcing allows for putting the blame on NGO, civil society, or migrants themselves. And so what we need really, it seems to me, from the perspective of EU law, what we need is to break this vicious institutional circle, and I'm very keen to discuss this with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Loïc. Virginie.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to participate in this roundtable. I will not contradict what the first two speakers have said. I'm just going to propose a different kind of approach, and as suggested by Enrico, focus on internal and external borders, something that can be summed up in one word: Schengen, right? We all, so I just want to remind you, basically 1985, Benelux, France and Germany, on a beautiful boat, not like the Aquarius, in a small town called Schengen, near the border of Luxembourg. Beautiful hills. Basically, it's a white wine growing region. And it's only this small club that decides to sign an agreement whereby internal borders would be lifted within that espace, within this Schengen area, and therefore there would be compensatory measures and external borders, entry into that Schengen space would be reinforced. So in 2015, when the issue of migration and asylum was, of course, on top of the agenda for EU institutions and leaders, it was 30 years after that Schengen Treaty was signed. The treaty actually became much more concrete by a 1990 implementation agreement, and actually slowly was institutionalized, became EU policy as opposed to just an intergovernmental agreement in 1997. So just what I want to say in my few minutes is, it's interesting to understand that still today, the logic, the reasons that explain why Schengen was created in 1985 is still the same. But 30 years later, it has had a number of adverse or negative consequences, not unintended, but adverse consequences. And in 2015 and thereafter, the word crisis of Schengen was used. So we have migration crisis, asylum crisis, crisis of Europe, but there was a specific notion that Schengen was under fire, was no longer respected. But what I'll show is actually after 2015, a lot of measures were adopted precisely because there was an emergency. Many of them were emergency measures. Emergencies or exceptional circumstances were used as legal, I would say, justification to continue as usual to reinforce the external borders of the EU. So the word crisis in that sense were useful to not change policy at the EU level during that period. So what was the logic of Schengen? The idea was it was important for undesirable migrants, not the tourists, not the business travelers, not to be able to set foot on Schengen territory. Now I would say EU territory, to be quicker. The way to do that was, for instance, the Schengen visa system, a list of countries that whereby nationals have to apply for a Schengen visa. In addition, there was also sanctions against airline companies or shipping companies called carrier sanctions. Sanctions against these companies if they did not make sure that people had the right passports and visa to enter Schengen territory. That meant very concretely that an asylum seeker could not show up at an airport, take a plane, arrive in Berlin or Paris and say, I seek asylum, please welcome me into your asylum system. It was also made more complicated for a number of other undesirable migrants. But that means that as soon as Schengen was really in place, it was, of course, more difficult for these kind of migrants to arrive. The logic was that it was, once migrants arrive, it will be very difficult to expel them. It's a kind of taboo, perhaps, but we talk perhaps not enough about expulsion policy. It's actually contrary to what populist or anti-immigration governments say. It's quite difficult to expel people and have the laissez-passer, the consular authorizations of third countries, or whether they're transit or origin country, to take people back. And once people are there, they have a modicum of minimal set of rights. And who knows, maybe they're going to hang out with NGOs, legal aid groups who are going to help them actually stay. So the logic of Schengen is really to try to prevent arrival on EU soil. And that is still the logic today. We mentioned Agadez. We now know that the EU border is basically north of the Sahara or south of the Sahara soon. But it's really that logic that prevailed. But most of the justification, of course, was to say, but the reason we have to do that is for a good cause, the lifting of the internal borders, the fact that you will no longer be checked at these internal borders. But that logic, which is sometimes called also the external dimension of EU migration policy, still continues. It's easier that people never set foot on this soil. Now, of course, the adverse consequence of that is that by definition, if you don't have the proper passport and visa, you enter irregularly. And by definition, almost, if you cannot easily take an airplane or a boat, you will take, whether it's a dinghy or a cargo, but you will take, by definition, irregular or illegal routes to arrive if you can't obtain that visa and passport. So Schengen also started the whole discussion on irregular entry, irregular migrants. In 2015, we're still in that context, but with what happens then is when the issue becomes high politics, the word crisis is used all the time, everywhere. So to continue, to continue to prevent people from arriving, for instance, member states try to find new solutions. There are many, I just want to give two examples. One example is, of course, an agreement, which is just a declaration, a piece of paper called the EU-Turkey Agreement. The EU-Turkey Agreement it's basically Angela Merkel and Mark Rutte, who's a Dutch prime minister, going to speak with the prime minister of Turkey, and then coming back to the council. The European Court of Justice even said that it couldn't really say much about to judge this agreement because it's actually just a declaration. And what the agreement said is that people arriving on EU territory, mainly in Greece, from Turkey would be expelled back to Turkey. If you read the declaration, it says that, of course, this will respect all international human rights provisions. This will respect the principle of non-refoulement. And this is just for a very small and limited period because of exceptional circumstances. And you will find that sentence, exceptional circumstances, in many other cases since 2015. This agreement or declaration was signed in March 2016, and indeed there has been a drop in the number of migrants who arrive from Turkey to Greece, and routes have slightly changed. As you know, people also are arriving, for instance, from Morocco to Spain, and still leaving from Libya. So this, the word crisis was really used to continue to have this externalization of policy. Another example is 2015, again, high-level summit in La Valette. And this time, there's an emergency trust fund for Africa. So under the guise of migration and development, the idea that people should stay in their country of origin, and isn't that great, which is a complex debate, but the idea was specifically an emergency fund to ensure the cooperation of African countries on the fight for irregular migration. Again, the word emergency, and it goes on and on. There are many other examples of that. The second, so in fact, although you can, the word crisis has been used, there hasn't been any kind of policy shift or shift in the logic of Schengen after 2015. One thing, of course, that is also meant when we talk about the Schengen crisis are the famous internal borders of the Schengen area. And indeed, in 2015, a number of countries actually reinstated controls at these internal borders, a number of them. The smartest country, of course, was France. There were two possible articles to do that. It's not illegal, it's in the chart, in the Schengen Treaty. There are two articles, Article 25 and 29, that allows you, again, if there is, it's supposed to be a temporary reinstatement of internal borders only if there are major security risk or risk to national security or exceptional circumstances. France was smart because it didn't, contrary to the other countries, it said that the reason it was reinstating the borders had nothing to do with migration. It had to do with the big summit, of course, COP21, the agreement on climate change, because who knows if those global justice activists would want to come to France. Of course, we had the terrorist attacks, and terrorist attacks have to do with national security. So it was in a way smarter because other countries in Europe actually said, well, it's because we don't want the migrants. And after a while, the Commission said that was not, you couldn't prolong this internal, having these internal borders forever. Is it really a crisis? Of course, it's a crisis again in the French-Italian relationship. But it's not the first time. Already in 2011, Berlusconi and Sarkozy, also had a fallout because Berlusconi, after the Arab Spring, a lot of Tunisians came to Italy, but were on their way to France. And Berlusconi said that they would be given a temporary residence permit for 6 months. The French were very angry and did reinstate border controls. And after that, Berlusconi and Sarkozy made up after a while. So this crisis, in a way, I don't think should be, I'm not saying we should not take them seriously, but they're actually in the treaties. And over the last 30 years, there were many, many times when internal borders were reinstated. It was just not in the public eye. Hooligans going to a football match, regularization campaigns for migrants, so still many, many reasons why, in fact, you could reinstate these borders. So just to conclude, I think it's important to understand the meaning of, after 2015, of this use of the word crisis or exceptional circumstances or the language of exceptionalism that we've known ever since 9/11, actually, in other types of security areas, has just meant that it's business as usual, in fact, in terms of continuing with the prevention of the arrival of migrants in Europe by all possible diplomatic and military means. Thank you.
Thank you, Virginie. And now Francesca Borgonovi gives us the approach on education, inclusive education approaches. Francesca, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. I'll take the title talking about migrations more generally, in particular because once kids are in classrooms, in most cases we care about their unique needs and all the different needs that they have, but their legal status is not necessarily the main big point for the teachers who are actually serving them. And I think the big spike in arrivals in European countries, in a sense, were a dress rehearsal for education systems, showing how unprepared many are to the long-term trends that actually will affect education systems in Europe in the future. Climate change, demographic imbalances mean that that's actually just going to grow in the future. So this was an opportunity for education systems to actually see how unprepared, in most cases, they were. Craig talked about Musa, who was 16 at the age of arrival, and I don't think it's an incident that he's actually speaking about a 16-year-old child. And I will speak about a child because, yes, he's a teenager with all the bad things that come with teenagehood, but he's a child nonetheless. And in fact, if we think about how many people sought asylum in 2017, almost a third of them were actually under the age of 18. In some countries, Austria, Germany, that was even higher. What does that mean? Well, they're children. They have unique needs. And refugee children, asylum seekers have particular sets of vulnerabilities. They need to adjust to a new language, to a new culture. They often have highly disrupted and minimal prior education. They often have disruption of family networks, which for children are very important. They are important for everyone, but in particular for children. They suffer from poverty, low socioeconomic status. They often have to change housing, and they have to face negative stereotypes. They have the stress of their parents. Oftentimes, the adult figures that protect us when we are children are in difficult circumstances themselves when they actually have a parent with them or a family member. So I do think that focusing on refugee children or asylum seekers and how they access and are given education services is important in the sense that it highlights how well or how unprepared education systems are to actually deal with the most difficult cases, and they highlight some of the structural problems that affect education systems. So what is an ideal education system, and what actually stands in the way of this ideal? Well, speaking with the other panel members before this afternoon, I talked about the issue of trying to have education systems that are inclusive. What does inclusiveness mean in an education system? Well, it's an education system that is accessible, it's adaptable, and it's acceptable. And what do I mean by these three terms? Well, accessible, pretty straightforward. Children need to be able to access school as soon as they possibly can. No excuses, no time. We're not there in many countries these days. What do I mean by adaptable? Well, adaptable to the individual vulnerabilities, whether that's lack of prior schooling, disrupted schooling, whether that's language difficulties, to ensure that actually the children are fully participating and actually have teachers and support professionals in the school that are there for them. And finally, what do I mean acceptable? And that's probably the hardest part and talks about the issue of values. I purposely, again, talked about integration rather than acculturation. Individuals arrive, migrants arrive. I'm a migrant, I'm Italian, I'm here in France. Arrive with their own culture, history, attitudes, values. And some are actually assets. Some are great things that education systems and societies could capitalize on. So how do we create education systems that are not just about trying to make the other just like us, but actually can capitalize on differences that do cater to language differences, that do try to ensure that new arrivals acquire language skills in the language of the country, but actually equally provide opportunities to foster a knowledge of their own language, of their own culture and traditions. And the aim is actually to ensure that individuals have self-respect. Why is that? Because that actually means that they will be able to acquire skills, certainly, but they will also be able to have social, psychological well-being and ensure long-term integration. So what are things that stand in the way of this ideal? I think if I have to, there are many things, but if we want to talk about the three key things at the moment are lack of early assessments of both language and individual skills. Children arrive, and oftentimes, even when they are given the opportunity to enter classrooms, we don't know how much they know and how much they don't know. All we see is that they actually don't understand what's happening, but how much is due to language inability and how much is due to lack of knowledge and skills in specific subjects, it's actually just not there. Some countries are doing pretty well. Sweden is one example, but we can definitely be more innovative in that respect. At the OECD, we have developed some tools to actually assess skills and language skills, and the European Commission has developed an assessment tool for skills for third country nationals. What do we need second is teachers. And in many countries, we lack teachers. We lack just the sheer number of teachers that are needed to be in classrooms. Why? Because, in fact, in many countries, we've had shrinking student populations, and teachers are not necessarily the greatest and highest paid people in societies, and their social status is not amazing. What does that mean? That in some countries, and I'll take the example of Sweden, there are currently 60,000 teachers that are missing to cater to the students that are there. And even when they are there, oftentimes they don't have the skills to deal with diverse student populations. In some cases, it's just that they don't receive the training in initial teacher training programs. In some cases, like the case of Italy for Enrico and myself, 63% of teachers are the age of 50 or older. What does it mean? Well, they trained to be teachers when Italy was a very, very different country. Do they receive enough teacher training while they are teaching? Not necessarily. In fact, when we ask teachers, do you feel prepared to teach to multicultural and multilingual classrooms? They say, I'm not, and I actually need training. I need to be able to do this with kids. They want to help, but they're not able to oftentimes. And when we ask foreign-born children that are currently in classrooms, what do you think about your relationship with teachers? Well, oftentimes they say, well, the teacher is speaking on me. The teachers, at the same time, are trying to help. The students say, well, actually, the teacher interacts much more with me than with other students. What's happening? The teachers have goodwill. They just don't know how to help, given the specific sensitivities and sensibilities of children. We talked about Turkey. Well, Turkey actually, if we want to think about how the education system is going, I'm an education specialist, not necessarily a migration specialist. Well, they have actually increased compulsory schooling for Turkish populations. Secondary schools have had to integrate in the past decade an additional 500,000 kids almost every year in secondary schools. Now, the average classroom in secondary schools in Turkey is actually over 45 students. When you have to integrate new arrivals, that's hard. I'm not saying it's impossible, but actually that's hard. The final thing is, well, in education, when we think about migration, we often focus about the skills that migrants need and how do we cater in terms of language training and in terms of upskilling for new arrivals, so they're not just integrated in the grade that they're supposed to given their age, but actually we need to focus on natives too. When we have diverse societies, it's not given that it's easy for native-born populations to deal with social, linguistic, and cultural diversity. It's actually pretty hard. And teachers, again, are not prepared to deal with some of the conflictual situations that happen on a daily basis in classrooms, but also teach to native-born students how to deal with diversity and how to interact effectively with other students. I came across a quote recently by Bill Clinton, who was honoring Martin McGuinness during the funeral. And he said, well, Martin expanded the definition of us and shrunk the definition of them. And what's happening in many European societies is we focus on us, and in terms of values, we actually say, well, it's them, and we oppose migration, they are bad, they are reducing or changing the cultural landscape of our countries. But actually what education systems can do is shrink the definition of us, and shrink the definition of them and expand the definition of us. But that actually is possible only when education systems are ready and prepared to do that. And it's not necessarily a given.
Thank you, Francesca. So now I was supposed to ask questions to our panelists, but we are a little bit late, and I would like to leave all the space to your questions. I'm sure that you will have a lot of questions. I ask our students to stand, to use the two micros we have there, to stand and to be close to the micros, queuing there. We will take maybe 2-3 questions. I'll ask you to to introduce yourself, and to say also if your question is to all our panelists or to a precise panelist. So please don't be shy, because time is limited, and I would like to take all the opportunity of this fantastic experience. Good. Go on.
Hello, thank you for your presentation. It was amazing. I'm Gabriela. I'm from the first year of Human Rights and Humanitarian Action. And I would like to know...
where are you from?
I'm from Brazil. I would like to know the difference between the term irregular migrants and illegal. When you choose the words, which one's correct to use, if one is more political, and I don't know exactly which terms we have to use. And I want to ask you the position of human rights in all of this. We have to dissuade people to migrate because they are not legally accepting here, if they are not asking for asylum. How they proceed, or how are we supposed to proceed when it comes to irregular migration? We have to take a position and, I don't know, advise them. Thank you.
Thank you. I don't know if there are any other questions immediately. Yeah, please. I ask you to prepare yourself and to queue so we can avoid wasting time.
Shout.
Yeah, we can
Shout.
hear you.
I work in the International Relations Research Center, and I'm currently doing an executive master's here in health policy. And I was really interested in Francesca's perspective, tying the education piece. I'm wondering if there are any good lessons learned from, you mentioned Sweden, or examples that you've seen that could be applied to other sectors where migrants also really need to be integrated in, such as healthcare systems.
Thank you. Third question.
Hi, my name is Abe Collier. I'm doing Masters in International Public Management from the US. One of the things, I worked in some of the camps in Greece for a little while, volunteered there. And one of the things that has really been frustrating for people who are currently migrants is the asylum system. As Mr. Spencer is probably aware, in the US, it would be much easier for, maybe not this administration, but another administration, to revamp the asylum process, make it quicker, make it more efficient. Europe, the European Union, that's harder because you have over 20 different sovereign states which have to agree, which have to combine their asylum system. So I'm curious to hear thoughts on the asylum system in Europe, what might be wrong with it, and what might be made better.
Okay, I think maybe, Loïc, you can start with this irregular, illegal.
Yes, of course. I mean, irregular or illegal. It's because I'm French that I refer to irregular migrations, but the accurate term in English is illegal migrations. That's the legal term. Where are you? I can't see you. Okay. the term used by EU law in English is illegal. In French, it would be irrégulier. Now, there is a dispute in academic circle about the term. You know, they are very sensitive terms. Huh? And illegal is a bit problematic, because illegal refers to the fact that these people are not in a, you see, their attribute is to being illegal. And so many people suggest that we should not say that this is illegal migrants, but these are people who are in an irregular situation. So, but legally, in all the legal texts in the EU, the term used is illegal migration. Now, we have in EU law This very strong, not obvious, not natural to me, but our mind is framed like this dichotomy between legal and illegal migrations. And there is a nexus, there is a link, there is a correlation. And in the political discourse, I think this is something to be reflected upon, that if we want to have legal migrations, it's how it goes, the argument. If we want to have legal migration, we have to fight against illegal migrations. It's how it goes in the political discourse in Europe today. This is shared by all the stakeholders. I think we may question that. It's not a logical connection. It's a political connection for sure, but not a logical one. Now on the asylum system, your questions, maybe I can say a word on this. I mean, we know the flaws. You're right. I mean, there is a problem of decision-making process in Europe, since we need not the unanimity of people, of the governments, but we need a majority of them through qualified majority voting. We know what is the issue. I mean, we know why it's flawed. We have a proposal of the Commission to fix the shortcomings of the asylum system. What is flawed is that there is only one member state responsible, and usually the state of first entry. As you know, you have this experience in Greece, who is responsible for the examinations of the asylum applications. We know it's flawed because it put a disproportional burden on Greece, Italy, Malta, Cyprus. It's flawed, we know that. And we know the remedy to that. The remedy to that is sharing the burden. If you want a nice word, nice term, solidarity, relocation, relocations. Now, the modalities of relocation are to be discussed. And this is exactly what has been proposed by the Commission, a system of relocations, sharing the burdens, so that Greece and Italy will not be under this huge pressure. There is no political agreement. So we are in a very interesting situation where we know the solutions, the rational solutions. The rational solution is there. It's in the text. We can discuss the modalities. It's rational. We know that if we want to have a functioning system, we need more solidarity. We need sharing of burdens, and not only sharing of cost, but sharing of people, of migrants themselves. We know it's there. So this is the odd situations where we know the solutions, the rational situation is there, but we are not governed by reason. And this is an interesting point to me, whether we should argue, like the Commission, but it's not very successful, that we should rely on reason, or whether we should buy the discourse that is we have to be responsive to the emotions and sensibilities and perceptions of people, even if these perceptions are wrong. To me, this is the debate.
Francesca, why don't you?
Yes, I don't know other sectors so well. What I can tell you is what is working particularly in local educational authorities or in local initiatives. In all countries, there are things that work better, that work worse. I think Sweden is a country where things work actually quite well. The problem is very much an issue of sheer numbers at the moment. But I do think education has a big advantage, and that advantage is that children are involved. And usually they are a place where communities come together, particularly in small centers. What does it mean? Well, there are families who, both from the new arrivals and local families, generally, it's not always the same, but generally come together, they feel welcomed, they actually get to know each other in places that are not threatening. And teachers, with all the problems in terms of teacher salaries, lack of status, have actually played a really important role in strengthening communities in the past few years. So I do think that that is a big advantage for education. And even though the practice often falls short, I would say, of the ideal, I like the fact that in English we talk about education rather than, for example, instruction. In Italy we have a ministry for instruction rather than a ministry for education. And when I hear the word instruction, I think about instruct. I instruct you to do this. It's mandatory, you do this. Education comes from the Latin educere, to bring out. and actually goes back, and again, this is in theory, then the practice falls short, but it's the issue of there is value in diversity. We all come, in a sense, with different attitudes, values, and sometimes they clash, but there is value in them. Just one thing, last week, if I hadn't become an education specialist, I would have wanted to become an astrophysicist. And maybe you have seen the pictures, not of the black hole, but of the light just across the black hole. And there was an astrophysicist, Jana Levin, who had a very beautiful quote. So I'll steal 1 minute, less than that, to quote that. And said, well, while the scientific implications will take time to unpack, some of the anthropological impact feels immediate. The light collected our way 55 million years ago. Over those eons, we emerged on Earth, along with our myths, differentiated cultures, ideologies, languages, and varied beliefs. Looking at that, I'm reminded that scientific discoveries transcend those differences. We are all under the same sky, all of us bound to display pale blue dot floating in dispersed local territory of our solar system, and et cetera, and et cetera. And it is, we are here on Earth, and we are different, but there is beauty in that, and education systems actually are trying to build on that difference.
I will ask Craig and Virginie if they want to add something. I would like to ask you also, both of you, to different points. One, Craig, think that you have now the magic wand in your hands, and you have the possibility to build up a European, so I would say institutional-based, save and rescue system. Mm-hmm. How does it work?
Sure.
And Virginie, the question for you is about, you mentioned Schengen. And Schengen is very interesting because Schengen was out of the treaties. So my feeling, but this is just because of my experience, my previous experience, I don't see any possibility to have really effective solutions within the present treaties. Because I feel, and I would say I'm afraid, that the present treaties they give the veto right to too many actors. Mm-hmm. So my personal feeling is that we need to have effective solutions, maybe to use the same Schengen method. So to try to build up something besides, something that is out of the treaties with a coalition of willings or something like that. What do you think about this point? Craig.
Thank you. If you don't mind, I'd like to just add something to the question on what the lessons learned on healthcare integration. My background is actually in health. I work at a public health school, and my focus is on migration and in public health. I would add to what has been said already by Francesca that there are a lot of myths and common misperceptions about migrants and health. It is commonly held that migrants are sicker and that they bring disease. It's commonly held that they are a burden on local health systems. Many of these things have been disproven multiple times. For anyone that's really interested, there has been a recent publication of a Lancet report on migration and health by a couple of my friends. I really encourage you to look at it, because what it does is it breaks down the actual evidence base to show that migrants who arrive are actually healthier than the host population. They are not a burden on health systems. You save money by providing health care to migrants who arrive, much as I'm sure you can make the same argument for education and other services. It's just difficult to convince people who often get words like crisis and emergency pumped into their head about why it's important for the long-term strategy to make investments in education, make investments in resettlement, and make investments, most importantly, in people's health. I'm sitting on a dissertation committee for one of our PhD students who's been working in Syria, with Syrian refugees in surrounding countries, and a lot of the discussion has been on how do we integrate care for non-communicable diseases. Up until 1990s, the 2000s, the focus, especially in humanitarian action, has been on cholera and on these really high-frequency, death-causing diseases, and that's shifted. Migrants that exist today, the majority of the 66 million migrants, aren't carrying around Ebola. They're carrying around hypertension and risk factors for cancer and other concerns. So I think one of the things that we need to do is shift the narrative about what migrants are, what their health status is, and what we can actually provide them, because it's in states and local health systems' best interest to provide those services. That's one question. And the other question, how do we build up a better search and rescue system? I think we need to start with the premise that it's the migrants that matter and not the smugglers. Once Mare Nostrum and other search and rescue mechanisms were put into place much earlier in 2013, 2014, there was initially a focus on providing search and rescue, on saving migrants. That changed with Operation Sophia and with Frontex, and the focus was less on saving migrants and more on stopping the smugglers. And it sounds like a really good idea, right? You're like, well, if you stop the smugglers, then you stop the problem. The issue and the problem with that is that in public health, we say every good intentioned intervention has an extremely complicated set of unfortunate impacts. When you focus on just the smugglers themselves, we know that there's actually been an increase in mortality associated with that. There hasn't been any change in the number of people that has been crossing. It has just actually made it more difficult and more dangerous. As an example, one issue that we always saw was the burning of wooden boats. And it was policy to burn wooden boats because the idea is if you get rid of these big wooden boats that carry 200, 300, 400 people, then they're just going to stop sending people. Unfortunately, smugglers are not as scrupulous as that, and they were more than happy to buy rubber boats online and put 140 people in a boat meant for 10. The same was true with the motors that were being put on the back of boats to get them out to international waters. The idea was that they could use these motors once they got out to international waters, then they would be rescued. And so what started happening is that once Frontex and Sophia started drowning the motors, because then they couldn't be reused, no one could come out and get them, no one could use them again for smuggling. Well, then smugglers were taking people out to 11.5 nautical miles, just short of the international line, and then coming out, taking the motors, and then just leaving people to drift. And so there were good, I think, intentions in terms of cutting down on the amount of smuggling. The unfortunate side effect was that it actually increased the risk and increased the likelihood of people drowning and dying. So I would say if we're going to build up a safe search and rescue mechanism, one, it needs to be supported by states. NGOs, no NGO wants to be doing search and rescue. It is, for my students that are in my class know this, it is not a neutral, independent, or impartial, it's not a humanitarian endeavor, except when that actual capacity doesn't exist at a government or at a state level. So I think, how would you build up a strong search and rescue mechanism? You would have it supported by the EU, by states. It would be focused on saving migrants that otherwise would drown and not necessarily on just focus on smugglers. And at the same time, we would get rid of all of the routes that are unnecessary and that cause people to take this journey. If 90-something% of Eritreans are going to be given asylum once they reach European shores, why do they have to get on boats? Why do many of them have to drown? Why can't they be processed in a way that's more respectful of the human rights? We talk about outsourcing of border control. It doesn't mean that you can outsource European values.
Virginie?
Thank you, Enrico. I will answer your question immediately, but just on illegal and irregular, I'm sorry I used the two words, but irregular actually comes up in the Schengen Treaty, and there's a good reason for that is there were no, the UK and Ireland were not there, so it's France, Germany, and Benelux, and of course when they translate into English, it's called Shenglish actually. You have to imagine people were policemen, border guards, not very good at English. We're back in the 1980s, so that's that's probably why when they translated irregulier by irregular, but it's only in Schengen, which is kind of specific. Schengen was indeed the idea of a club, a small number of countries, and people could come in the club. But just like any fancy English club, you have a nice ball. You can put a white ball if you want that person. Sorry, if you don't want someone to enter the club, you blackball them. That it was the same idea with Schengen. We would accept Italy, Spain, etc., if we consider that we could trust them, if they had the same kind of ethos and professional ethos as we had, and if we thought that they would really protect their external borders. So there was really in 1997, during the Amsterdam Treaty negotiations, the Justice and Home Affairs ministries were very, very mad to see that the diplomats who were in charge of the negotiations stole their baby, their Schengen baby, and integrated it by protocol into EU law. That was never the original idea. And it's true that in the recent years, you have people, I would think probably including Emmanuel Macron, who is very much back to this idea of, and it has, as you said, different names. I call it Europe à la carte. You choose the menu, because after all, there were also people who were never in Schengen, like the UK. The question is, does that apply for everything that concerns Schengen? For instance, the visa system, it's more and more efficient on the ground after all these years. One of the reasons is there's a community of practice in consulates, largely because they've outsourced visa delivery to private firms, too big, VFS Global and this kind of thing. So in some areas, Schengen works. So that's why I say maybe in a, we're focusing on the crisis and the internal borders, but as usual, it's very difficult to undo a policy once you have created so many vested interests for now, a couple of decades at least. So that would be my, my quick answer to that. Last point on human rights, the question that was on human rights, I think one of the developments that we've seen, again, not in recent years, for a long, long time, is the creation of dichotomies. So Loïc Azoulai spoke about illegal versus legal. You have to have, if you want legal migration, you need to be strong, on preventing illegal, etc. One of the dichotomies has been, of course, the security versus humanitarian aspect of border control. So those who say, yeah, migrants are a security threat, and those who say, and that's why we don't want them. Others who say, no, it's, we have to save them, and what's happening in the Mediterranean is a humanitarian problem. When we use those words, so that's when migrants are victims, I guess. I don't think Moussa is a victim in a way. I mean, what you describe of this young boy seems like he knew exactly, what he was doing. And what word we don't use is human rights, which is completely different, right? It's a human rights perspective means that person, minor or adult, as agency, is a person with and whose minimum and whose basic rights have to be protected: rule of law, due process, and some very, very basic principles like indeed non-refoulement, what the very small core of international law that regards migration, which is actually not so much. And that perspective has disappeared. It's a kind of, Manichaean argument between humanitarian versus security approaches. And that's not very helpful for the debate, I think.
Thank you. So, please.
Hello, my name is Zivka Getsova. Last semester I was a trainee in Frontex. I'm Bulgarian. My question is more related to what Craig was doing on board of Aquarius. So I wanted to know who bears the responsibility of migrant health screening. And, I know it's double fault, once on board of the SAR vessel and once in hotspots, but I would like to know more about how it's organized. And also, in your opinion, what is the level of the integration within the European Union when it comes to health security? Thank you.
Hello, my name is Joanna and I'm from South Africa and I'm doing the Human Rights and Humanitarian Action Masters. I also had a quick question for Craig Spencer. I heard that I think that you said that the mortality rates because of the criminalization of NGOs have gone up twofold. I've read like various accounts. I've seen 30-fold in one report, I think. I was just wondering if you could point me towards some sources. Where did you get that number, and are there any numbers that are reliable? Thank you.
Hello, I'm Camilla Sante. I'm Italian, and I'm in the first year of Master in European Affairs. I have a question for Professor Azoulai. Professor, correct me if I'm wrong. It's a question very specific on the Dublin regulation. The Commission proposed a mechanism for the reallocation of applications that is a corrective mechanism in the case that a country is overwhelmed with applications. Why didn't the Commission propose a permanent reallocation system? Do you think that the Commission thought about it, was afraid to propose it because fearing that the Council will never approve it? What's your opinion on that? Thank you.
Thank you. Craig.
Great, thank you. I'll answer the first one, the first question. Who bears the responsibility of migrant health screening, and then integration regarding health security? So who bears the responsibility for migrant health screening? It depends on who picks people up. MSF, Médecins Sans Frontières, had a dedicated doctor on board. We had 2 nurses, an ICU nurse from Germany and an ICU nurse from the US, as well as a midwife. We probably had the most extensive health screening of any of the NGOs, or maybe any of the people out there doing migrant search and rescue. There were certainly doctors on the Italian Coast Guard boats. There were doctors on some of the NGO boats, although not on all of them. And sometimes there were on other vessels that may come across migrants, but I would say the majority of people who were rescued probably did not receive a medical screening. And even for those that were rescued, my medical screening for 99% of people had to be brief. It had to be asking them one question, looking in their eyes, and seeing them walk, and determining whether or not they were okay or whether or not they needed immediate intervention. That was our focus, to find the sickest people as quickly as we could. That doesn't necessarily mean just health issues like people that have abscesses or skin infections or pneumonia. Sometimes, and the majority of the time, it meant people who had been the victims of abuse, frequently sexual violence. We had a midwife on board, not because we delivered a lot of babies, although we delivered a few, but really had training in sexual and gender-based violence to talk to women and men who had been victims of sexual violence, primarily in Libya. For us, we would have these discussions. We would give people a space to share their health concerns as well as their histories, specifically around violence. And then we were kind of stuck about what we do with this information, because we would like to provide it to people. Many people, once they get to shore, don't have a lot of access to reliable healthcare. That also depends on how busy ports were at a certain point. If 10,000 people or 20,000 people arrived in Italy, for example, during a week, we couldn't guarantee that Save the Children and the Red Cross and everyone is going to be at a disembarkation port. We didn't know who we were going to be able to hand people over to. We didn't know if there was going to be enough emergency services to share our sickest cases. We would always talk with the Ministry of Health. We would always try to prioritize cases. But once people were off our boat, we couldn't do anything. We couldn't do anything else in terms of providing them medical services or even ensuring that they had any type of follow-up, which was difficult for all of us. And I understand that it was difficult as well for people at disembarkation ports, trying to prioritize what we think is important, which may be emergency cases. And then I think, which is the second part of your question, which is health security. And by that, I presume you mean big, concerning, worrisome cases of things like Ebola or HIV or tuberculosis. Well, the thing that most people don't recognize is that the majority of people who are sick have died before they've got on a boat. They've died before they made it to a beach in Libya. They've died before they've had any opportunity to get out of detention. Only the healthiest people are able to survive because the sickest just don't get sent, they die. The woman that I showed you a picture of, who had just delivered a baby in the middle of the Mediterranean, was put on a boat because she was in labor, and in the detention center they knew they didn't want her to deliver there, so they put her on a boat with the hope that she'd be rescued and she would deliver the baby. So from a health security standpoint, sure, there were cases, I'm sure, of HIV, there were cases of tuberculosis, there were cases of other kind of reportable infectious diseases, but it was extremely, extremely, extremely small compared to the number of people we rescued and compared to the much greater issues of hypertension, non-communicable diseases, and mostly sexual violence among men and women. For the second question, the source of numbers. Anyone that quotes any number regarding deaths in the Mediterranean and regarding the number of crossings in the Sahara, whatever it may be, are just using not made up numbers, but guesses. The problem is that I work as someone that focuses on counting mortality, on counting dead, which sounds grim, but it's made worse by the fact that there's not a really good way to do it. So for example, if a boat goes missing in the Mediterranean with 130 people on board and all of them die, it gets counted as 0 deaths. If 129 people go missing and there's one person on board, they say, how many people were on this boat? And they say, this person says, I think 130. So they say, okay, 129 people died. There are different mechanisms that are used by different organizations, often depending on their political purpose, to count the number of dead, the number of departures, the number of drowned. I think that the one that is using the best methodology and is trying to get reliable, verifiable reports is IOM, the International Organization for Migration, their Missing Migrants Project. And I believe it was their number that said it was 1 in 31, and more recently is 1 in 14 people that step on a boat in Libya to try to make the Mediterranean crossing will die. So I can't say whether it's actually twice or 3 or 10 or 40 times more. What we do know is that the number of people crossing has gone down, but the relative risk of you dying if you step on a boat in Libya has gone up.
Thank you, Loïc.
Yes, on asylum. I think I remember the proposal of the Commission dates back 2016, I think. And we are in a complete stalemate. There is no agreement. We are in a complete impasse in this field. So you're right, the compromise was the one you depicted, but it seems it was already too audacious, since there is no agreement on the very principle of relocation of asylum seekers. If we come back to the topic, to the question of values, I would put it like this: there is an agreement on the value that these people, refugees, deserve protection in Europe on grounds of traumatic experiences they had, on grounds of persecutions. There is a clear agreement on this, on principle. But what we miss in Europe, I would put it like this: what we miss is virtue. We should add the notion of virtue, that is a disposition to act in accordance with the values. And there is no agreement at all. So it seems that the Commission, the way you put it, I think is right. It was a cautious proposal, but there is no agreement at all. We are in a complete impasse, where in other fields there are actions taken by the member states at the external border, enhancing the control of the external borders, externalization of migration policy, outsourcing the border control. There is agreement, there is a lot of activity in the EU, but on asylum, the value is there, but the virtue is not there, and so we are in a complete impasse in that respect.
Yeah, just one thing on this. On top of value, I would say courage to add. There was a very good paper by a researcher at the London School of Economics and Zurich, Dominic Hartgarden, who had a paper in Nature Human Behavior on preferences for relocation in different European countries. And the gist of the paper was actually that Europeans, even in countries that would have gotten many more as a result, were actually quite supportive. And sometimes there is a lack of courage and a lack of articulating, in a sense, the underlying virtue that comes from relocation on the part of politicians.
We are close to conclusion, so I can take the 4 final questions, and then we will have a final round of answers. So please.
So good afternoon. My name is Josiane Matar. I'm from Lebanon. I'm doing my master's in international public management. Thank you all for this interesting discussion. I just was really interested in what Professor Craig mentioned about the EU funding kind of militias when the Libyan Coast Guard, because we're witnessing the same thing in Lebanon, in which the EU funds are being used for corrupted practices rather than going to help the refugees. And regarding the externalization of the crisis, we can also notice that it's not something that would last in the long term, and it's not a permanent solution for the European Union. So I was wondering, what do you think should be the starting point, or the area in which the after the European election, the focus should be on in order to solve this crisis, knowing that the rational assumption when it comes to burden sharing is kind of far from being achieved. So what's, in your opinion, going to be like the initial starting point to achieve the long-term solution? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. I'm a Norwegian student. My name is Magnus. I'm at SIA in the International Development Master's Program. I have a question for the whole panel. First of all, a very quick claim. I would claim that the current hysteria connected to migration today is a political construct. There's always been xenophobia, but the fear that we feel today, or that many Europeans feel today, as Professor Azoulai mentioned, is something that has been created by politicians. Douglas Massey in the US has documented very well that President Reagan in the 80s started this hysteria by talking about migration flows that were uncontrollable. And I think we have that hysteria in Europe as well. So my question goes to all of you. It's a very difficult one, but you're experts, so I hope to get some good answers. What kind of policies could the European Union enact in order to reverse this hysteria, to create more trust and to have less fear? Thank you.
Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you, everyone, for the panel. I had two questions, but I don't think we'll have time for both. What kind of limits exist against the rising criminalization of aid and support of migrants today to protect the actions of NGOs and the freedoms of their activists?
Could you just ask the question one more time? I'm sorry.
What kind of limits are there to the criminalization of NGOs and their action in the Mediterranean Sea so that the action can actually still exist?
Good evening, I'm Isabella. I'm a first-year student in International Public Management. My question regards the temporary relocation scheme and the consequence that it had, that I think it really accentuated the fracture with the Central Eastern European countries, and especially the Visegrad group. And I was wondering if you thought that, given the strong opposition from this group, whether it was feasible or even desirable to pursue permanent relocation schemes, or even, let's dream, like the abrogation of the Dublin system.
Thank you. So I think we can have a final round of reactions. Craig?
Yeah. It was Josella, I believe I'll start with. The question was, externalization is not a permanent solution, and then what should be the initial point of really starting this discussion after the election in terms of working on migration. I agree, externalization is not a permanent solution. As has been mentioned before, when you outsource borders, you also outsource that responsibility. And one thing I didn't talk about was how anti-migration policies are being mixed with counterterrorism policies, primarily in Niger and Chad. I'm from the US, which has a lot of drone bases all over the world, and I was telling the panelists beforehand, sitting in a migrant ghetto in Agadez, looking out the window, looking out over the wall, and looking out over the field, you can see a $100 million US drone base, the second largest drone base in the world. One of my friends and colleagues on my project went to the northeast of the country working on migration, and when he was there, someone said, "Hey, did you know that your American friends are here building a CIA drone base?" And he was there working on a migration project and broke this in the New York Times about the CIA with a drone base in the northeast. And I point that out because what happens when you mix anti-migration or migration management with counterterrorism and with border externalization is that human rights are ultimately impacted, and that they will increase the number of violations as well as the number of deaths that are associated with people trying to cross borders or even within borders. So I think that's one of the issues in terms of externalization. As a long-term policy, it might work in bringing down numbers, but in terms of how it reflects on values and human rights, I think it's a bigger question for everyone. The initial point of starting after election, how you talk about migration, I don't know. One, I'm not European, I just happen to work here. I'm thinking about what I can do in the US and how crazy that makes me. I recognize that my voice might also be a minority. I mean, looking at the rise of populism and nativism and how strongly anti-migration sentiment is amongst people who in many aspects, at least from the US perspective, are not at all ever impacted by migration, just shows me how well crafted the anti-migration message is. In my class, we talk about the importance of media in politics and how this needs to be used to create a narrative and drive the narrative. We need people that support migration, at least that understand migration is not as dangerous as as many people like to make it out to be. We need to talk about that narrative. We need to do it in a better way that combats the fear and the fear-mongering of many anti-migration populists. I don't know how to do that. I don't know that there's been anyone that's done that well. I'm fearful that it'll be represented not only in EU politics, but in US politics as well. Just within the past day, the Attorney General in the US has basically made it even more difficult to apply for asylum in the United States, despite us being a signatory to the refugee conventions. So we may be a limited or a biased viewpoint up here, and you should keep that in mind when you're hearing what we say, but these are all really important questions, and I don't unfortunately know the answer to.
Thank you. Virginie.
It's kind of funny that an American citizen says, I don't want to say anything about the EU because I'm American. We have freedom of speech even for foreigners, I think you can say what you want about EU developments. Actually, I'm going to answer the question. Okay, so there are European elections this May. And I have to say that if one institution has worked well in the last few years, it's the European Parliament on this particular issue. And then it gets stuck. As Loïc says, then it's an impasse and it doesn't get through. And one of the discussion has been on humanitarian visas. So the extent to which the Schengen code that I mentioned, the visa Schengen code, could also be reformed to include giving visas to people who are in places like Lebanon, precisely, and so that they wouldn't take a boat or they wouldn't go at sea, and have provisions within the Schengen visa. So the Parliament has explored, has ordered a lot of reports, but it has a special committee called the Libe Committee on, looking at civil liberties, etc. That will be probably about as strong in the next election. We shouldn't forget that, as far as we know, the populist groups are not going to be necessarily that much more numerous if, of course, the UK is really, really out of the process, because they were a big part of this group. And the last point to maybe follow up on Greg is this question of the narrative and the media. I think one of the issues, and that's one of our responsibilities as academics, I think, to point that out, is there are a lot of misperceptions of migration in public opinion. People usually overestimate the number of foreigners, where they come from, if they think they're poor. But then there's a misperception of politicians on what people think. So it's a sort of double misperception. Politicians tend to overestimate the extent to which immigration really drives everything, including with the famous Gilets jaunes of France. Yes, there were, of course, anti-immigration sort of conspirationist messages by the Gilets jaunes, but mostly they talked about very basic kind of cost of living issues, and migration was not on top. So I think, as academics, sometimes we have to look at public opinion and media coverage, but also try to explain to policymakers that they're exaggerating this lens after a while. And the only people we can convince, of course, are reasonable center-right and center-left politicians. But even them sometimes, I think, are buying into this, this very easy security discourse. Thank you.
Thank you, Loïc.
Yes, I want to pick up on the difficult question you raised. I mean, following up to Virginie's message. I think the question. There are two questions. One is a construction. It's a construction by political leaders, and it's true. I mean, to a certain extent, there are misrepresentations or misconceptions by political leaders themselves. To a certain extent, it's an area. It's true. It's an area of instrumentalizations, heavy instrumentalization of public sentiment. There is no doubt on this. And I think center-right and center-left governments buy indeed into flawed discourses. They play these games, there is no doubt. So we should resist misconceptions, misrepresentations. But I would add something. I would say that yet public sentiments are there. They may rely on illusions. They may rely on false conceptions, but they are there, and they have some social effects. And I think it's difficult to hear, I'm sure. I think we should be responsive to this. We should be responsive to the fears, to the distress, to the insecurity felt by European people. Now, how to do that? Designing new policies is not difficult. We know the solutions, as I said, and in relation to asylum, that would be the same in relation to other fields here. We know the rational solutions. It's not difficult to design new policies. And I should add that the Commission did a great job in that respect over the last years, relocation schemes and other kind of schemes. There are shortcomings to these schemes, but I mean, we know the rational solutions. That's not the problem to me. The problem for these European elections and after the European elections is to change the mental framework, to change the frame, of references. And how to do that? I would suggest there are different possibilities. One is to resist false beliefs, to insist on true facts. It's not true that there is a mass influx of migrants into Europe today. This is important, but it's not enough. I would add we need to change the way migrants are portrayed. They are portrayed as victims or as not worthy of trust. We have two ways to portray migrants today, as you said, Virginie. And we need to reincorporate, in my view, we need to reincorporate the motives and the values of the migrants into our policies, into our discourse. As it stands, migrants have no agency, as Virginie said. But it's not only that. It's not only that they have no agency, they have no existence. They are victims or not worthy of trust. They have no existence. They have no consistence. They are objects of institutional cooperations. The first step they have in Europe, they are in the hands of institutions. Also in relation to integration, to social integration, they are in the hands of institutions. They do not exist by themselves. So we need, in my view, we need to reincorporate the individual values, the emotions, the stories, of course, of migrants into our framework. And we need to, and I conclude with that, and we need to bring back civil society. Something that is very striking today in Europe to me is this fight of member states, not against EU institutions, and it used to be the case. It's a fight of member states against civil society groups. There is a struggle here. There is a struggle against organization and civil society, where in civil society with certain groups, we have the connection between values and virtues. This connection exists. And so and the criminalization of NGO is just one illustration of these trends, where we see states fighting against their own society. So I think we need to bring back civil society into our EU framework.
Thank you, Francesca.
Yes, I mean, public opinion surveys actually do not show a huge change in averages, for example, in opposition to migration. What they do show is an increased polarization. So attitudes that are very positive and attitudes that are very negative. And perhaps what we do lack is mobilization of people that actually do have positive perceptions, that do see value in the diversity that migrants bring. And I think for an education person like myself, the underlying problem is that oftentimes this polarization is very much across the education spectrum. Highly educated people, not all, but generally, tend to be more having more positive views of migrants. Less educated people, less positive. Now, there is an economic dimension to that. Feelings of economic threat are more prevalent among those that have lower skills, and fear, even if that's not necessarily the case, but feel and fear substitution. For highly educated individuals, on the other hand, it's much more complementarity. But actually, what really, really differs is feelings of cultural threat to your own identity, to who you are, that very much speak to those that are less well educated. And here I'm talking about quantity. And again, as an education specialist, when I do analysis, I'm always excited when you find a positive association between whatever outcome in education, say, well, more education is better. But actually, if you think about this issue of polarization, what we do see is growing economic inequality. The better educated have greater and greater rewards. And now they actually feel morally superior. They are the ones who actually have positive values and actually judge negatively those who have negative values. So I do think that there is a role for education, and in particular, compulsory basic education. It's currently not doing its job in making sure that everyone is well equipped, to fully participate in the labor market. Then we can talk about other issues, but then actually have rewards. And then finally, to be able not to feel culturally threatened by diversity.
So, time is over, unfortunately. I would like to give you other food for thoughts coming from maybe also my personal experience around the Mare Nostrum Italian initiative. But I would like just to leave you at the end with one point. We listened really a fantastic debate with many important and many deep point of views, full of ideas. And I would like just to ask you to think how far is the institutional level today thinking the fact that is in the hands of the coordination of ministers of home affairs. You immediately think the distance between the complexity of what we discussed here, health, education, social inclusion, problems of related to security, but at the same time with relationship with other countries, third countries, and the present system is based on the coordination of Minister of Home Affairs. And frankly speaking, my personal experience teaches me that is really completely inadequate, is insufficient, is not the right way to deal with maybe the most important challenge in our societies today, which is very transversal, which is very horizontal, which I would say needs the possibility to have together some of the different point of views that we were lucky today and this afternoon to listen. So I would like just to ask you to join me to give a big applause to our panel and thank them for their participation.